it's time to assemble the crocuses. You should have 1 flower center, 6 petals, 3 leaves, 1 in each size. You will need a 16 gauge florist stem wire. You'll need some embroidery floss in your petal color, some light green embroidery floss, and some tan or beige embroidery floss, some green floral tape, and 30 or 32 gauge wire in any color. I'm just using the one that's going to show up on screen a little bit better, but it doesn't matter which color you use because it is going to get covered up. You'll also want some scissors and some wire cutters. To start out, we're going to wrap our 16 gauge stem wire with floral tape. I said florist stem wire, but you could also use galvanized steel. 16 gauge galvanized steel will work just fine. So we're going to cover this with floral tape first. That will make the surface of the wire less slippery, give it a little bit more grip so that your components are less likely to slip around on your stem while you're assembling. So to do that, I've got my floral tape. It's still attached to my little spool thing. And I'm going to stretch the end because that's what activates floral tape and makes it work. So you're going to cover it over the tip of the stem wire, kind of at an angle. And I have a little bit kind of extending above the stem wire. I'm going to fold this floral tape around the stem and stick it to itself on the other side. And there's going to be this little kind of tag of floral tape sticking up. I just fold that down. That's going to cover the top of my stem. And now I'm going to start spinning my stem wire and stretching my tape as I go. I'm going to hold it at an angle so that I get a nice wrap around my stem. So start spinning around the stem. Sometimes right at the top, if you kind of squeeze and pinch, that helps it to stick down. So you should be going down at an angle, and remember you need to stretch the floral tape to activate it. And I'm just going to spin my stem wire, holding my tape at an angle, stretch, spin, stretch, spin. The floral tape kind of needs to overlap just a little bit, but not very much. That way you're continuously working down the stem and you're not staying in the same place and making a really thick wrap. Alright, so there's my stem wire covered. Now we need to cut a few feet of the 30 gauge or 32 gauge wire off of the spool. And I'm going to straighten it out just so it's not unruly. Alright, take the flower center and we're going to put it right at the top of the stem. Pinch and hold that right there, just so that the little end of the stem is right underneath the bottom of the stamen. And then we'll take a little tail of the 30 gauge wire and kind of point it down towards the bottom of the stem. And I'm going to pinch that with my fingers. And then as I'm wrapping this wire down the stem to assemble my pieces, I'm going to cover over that tail. That will help secure the end. So I'm going to pinch and hold both the assembly wire and my little stamen right below where I'm going to be wrapping. I'm going to wrap my wire very tightly there, just a few times right below that stamen. I do not want my assembly wire to start moving down the stem very far because that's going to create some gaps in my flower pieces and make it harder to do the assembly. So keep your assembly wire up high, right below the component that you're adding on. Now it's time to add in the petals. I'm going to be using the same assembly wire there. I'm going to try and add in 3 at a time. This is a little bit hard to hold, so if you need to add in 1 or 2 at a time, go ahead and do that. That's fine. I'm going to try the 3 just so I have fewer wraps with my wire. That's going to help to make my stem less bulky. Because if I can wrap 3 wires with the same 3 wraps, it's just fewer times that I have to wrap around the stem wire. So I'm going to try and add in 3 at a time. So I'm going to make these first 3, and I'm going to pinch and hold. I'm not really lifting up my fingers very much, just enough to kind of slide that petal in. So I'm holding all my pieces on there. Okay, so these first petals should make kind of like a triangle shape right around the stamen, like this. These are going to be the inner petals. Pinch and hold right there. And we want our petals to be kind of lined up right underneath the stamen. We don't want them too far down because that's also going to make a gap with a lot of exposed stem wire. And we want our assembly wire to wrap around. And again, we're going to try and keep this really high up right below the bottom of the petals. And we're going to wrap 3 or 4 times. Now, do you see where I've tied off those working wires for all my petals. There's these little coils there of wire. I'm going to try to wrap my assembly wire in those little coils there, because that's going to grab those petals really nice and tight. And I'll kind of make it so that the assembly wire can't slide down, because then it's trapped inside those little wire wraps. So I've just wrapped a few times there. I've got one little wire here that's a little bit loose. I'm going to try and fold that up and wrap over it. So just wrap a few times there with those petals. And again, your assembly wire should still be up high, right below the petals, not moving far down. And if you are adding in just 1 or 2 petals at a time, you will want to wrap each petal, each 1 or 2 petals about 3 or 4 times before you add in the next set of petals. Now, important here, this is not completely secure yet. It won't be until a little bit later. So I'm not removing my hands here. I'm still pinching and holding these petals in place. I'm going to add in the next 3 petals. So I'm going to kind of just barely lift my finger up there, slide a petal in, and these petals should, you should position them so they're kind of sticking out between the previous layer of petals. So one right there, one over here, just barely lifting my finger up. And then another one back here. Should have started with this one. Right back there. Make sure that all my stem wires are straight. It's definitely harder to try and hold 3. So I will not blame you if you want to do just 2 at a time here. This is very difficult to hold. All right. I'm going to go again with my assembly wire, wind around a few times. All right. And once you've wound down a few times, we can start to wind our assembly wire further down the stem. So I'm going to start moving it down the stem, being really tight with my wraps here, but I'm not wrapping them completely stacked close together. I'm kind of spacing them out a little bit so I can move down the stem faster. Oh, my petals just came. Okay. Continue wrapping down just a little ways below the flower. You don't need to go very far down, just a little ways is going to be fine. And then we're going to lift up one of the single petal wires, and I'm going to wrap my assembly wire around that a couple of times to help hold it in place, and then trim that off. Now, very important here, as you're assembling your flowers, you do want all of these individual petal stems to be nice and straight. We don't want them swirling and spinning and twisting around the stem, because that's going to create extra lumps in your finished flower stem. So when you're done adding your petals in, you should have these 3 making a little triangle in the center, and then the last 3 are going to make another little triangle kind of outside those inner petals. Now we're going to cover over this with floral tape. This is just going to make it smoother so that we get a smoother wrap with our embroidery floss. So I'm going to stretch the end of my floral tape, and I'm going to press it against my flower stem, try and wrap it around and pinch it to itself on the other side. And I'm going to try and wrap up a little ways to get right underneath those petals. Really squeeze right there below the flower, and then start moving down. Angle downward, stretch, spin. Keep an eye on all of these little petal stem wires to make sure that they are staying straight and not spinning around your stem. And I'm going to go down until at least the bottom, the last one of those little flower stem wires, or petal stem wires. Now we're going to start flossing down the stem. We're going to start right below the flower head using the same color of floss as the petals. So I've cut just a couple feet of this color off of the skein. I'm not leaving it attached like this. It's just a little bit easier to work with if you cut a little bit off of there. But since we're only going down, you really only need like a foot or 2 cut off of the skein for this part. Now, just like the assembly wire, we need to leave a little tail in our floss, and we're going to press that down against the stem. The bottom of that floss is pointing down towards the bottom of your stem. Kind of pinch right there below the bottom of your flower. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out these outer 3 petals just a little bit there, and I'm going to wrap my floss between these 2 layers of petals just to make sure that I can cover up any little assembly wires that might be exposed between my layers of petals. So I'm going to go above these outer 3 petals. Make sure that you're not catching, like right here, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it very well because it's the same color as my beads, but my floss kind of caught on the bottom of that petal, and I don't really want that to happen. So I'm going to kind of hold it down with my finger and then go down around the next petal. It kind of helps to keep it from getting snagged on those inner petals. So I'm going to go around a couple times there to cover up any of the assembly wires right there below that first layer of petals. All right, now I'm going to fold those little petals back up into place, and I'm going to continue wrapping down the stem. Now, when you have the little stem that tapers like this, where it's a little bit wider at the top and a little bit skinnier at the bottom, it's a little bit harder to wrap your floss right on this part right here. So you need to be really patient with yourself and really patient with the floss. Now, this is 6-strand embroidery floss. It's just regular, I'm pretty sure it's just made out of cotton, but it's made out of 6 threads that are twisted together. To get a nice flat twist, we're going to, wrap on our stem, we're actually going to untwist these so that all 6 of those little strands of floss kind of sit right beside each other instead of twisting around each other. So take a minute, untwist your floss, and then we're going to wrap down the stem. I'm going to keep and hold tension on my floss while I'm wrapping. Try and carefully wrap down this little taper. That's my least favorite part. And sometimes I don't get complete coverage up there, and I just kind of go with it and let it be. Now, do you see how my floss is not really, I have one little piece of floss that's kind of separating itself out there. I'm going to pull down on my floss a little bit to try and straighten that back out, and then continue wrapping. And I do want my little floss wraps to lay directly beside each other so I get full coverage on my stem. And I'm going to continue wrapping like this. I'm untwisting my thread and spinning my stem until I've got maybe 3/4 of an inch there below the flower head in this purple color. All right, somewhere around there is plenty long. Now what we're going to do is we're going to switch from this purple color to this light green color. I should have cut this off before. Let me try and put this down. Hopefully my thread won't come too far undone there. I'm going to cut a couple feet of this light green embroidery floss off of the skein. I don't know how many feet I cut off there. That's probably 3 or 4 feet. It's a lot more than what I need, but that should be fine because then I can just use the leftover bits on the next flower. All right, so let me rewrap the little part that came undone. Now this is how I add in a new thread. You can use this if you run out of thread while you're flossing your stems. I'm going to use it to switch colors here. I only need a couple inches there of my purple, so I'm going to cut that off. Save the other end for the next flower. And then I'm going to take this light green floss and I'm going to add it in using my finger to kind of hold the end of my first color of embroidery floss. And then I'm going to add in this second color, this light green. But again, I want the bottom of my thread pointing down towards the bottom of the stem. Pinch and hold that in place for a minute here. I'm going to have that green floss coming up and out of the way. I'm going to take this little tail of the purple floss. Not wanting to hold in place there. Take this little tail of the purple floss. I'm going to wrap over the green floss one time, and then I'm going to put the tail of that purple floss down the stem so that as I'm flossing down the stem with the green, I can cover over both the light green and the purple at the same time to kind of secure the ends of those floss. I'm very carefully, right where that ends, I'm going to start wrapping with my light green floss there. Same direction that I was wrapping with the purple floss, and just continue down. And once the end is secure there, I just kind of flip my flower over so that I can spin, untwist my floss so it's nice and flat, and spin. And we're going to floss down this stem, I think it's around 3 or 4 inches. I usually don't measure that sort of thing. I just look it out with my eyes. I don't know a better way to say that. I just kind of estimate the length there as to what feels right. But I'm pretty sure it's somewhere around 3 or 4 inches. And crocus do grow to different flowering heights. If you're making an arrangement with multiples of these crocuses, I do recommend making them all a slightly different height, just so that you get a little bit of variation in your flowers. Got this little tail of my purple floss that keeps spinning around my stem, and I'm going to try and keep that straight so it doesn't make too much of a lump on my finished flower stem. Okay, that's the length I'm going to go with for this crocus. That's not even 3 inches there. That was about 2.5 inches maybe on this flower. And this time I'm going to tie off my floss. I'm just going to cut a couple inches there at the bottom and then kind of loop the end over the stem. And then take this little tail around the back of the stem and then up through the loop. Just going to make a little knot there right around the stem so it doesn't come unflossed. Now this step that I'm doing here with the leaves is optional. You don't have to do it. I'm going to show you guys how to do it because it might help some of you to assemble your flowers a little bit easier. Now just like we wrapped the 16 gauge stem wire with floral tape, you can also wrap your component stem wires with floral tape. That'll also add a little bit more grip to those stems so that the little assembly wires can help hold them in place a little bit easier. It does add extra bulk to your stem, but it can be very helpful if you have a really hard time holding those pieces in place and if they're moving around on you a lot, then this can be a helpful thing that you can do. So I've just taken some floral tape, cut it in half lengthwise. Using a skinnier tape does help reduce the amount of bulk that you're adding to your stem, which is why I cut it in half for this. Now, just like the 16 gauge stem wire, we're going to stretch the end of the floral tape to activate the stickies. And then we're going to wrap around the component stem wire right below that last row of beads. Fold the floral tape around the stem and kind of attach to itself on the other side. Now it can be a little bit tricky to get this floral tape to want to stick to this stem. So sometimes what I do is just kind of spin the tape and the component right there between my thumb and forefinger and kind of squeeze together to try and get this floral tape to stick down. And then angle downward and stretch and spin. Stretch and spin. You do want to angle downward enough that you're just barely getting a little bit of overlap. That's going to help you reduce the amount of bulk that you're adding to your stems. And you can do this to all of your component wires. If you're having a hard time getting your petals to stay in place, you can add that to the bottom of your petal stem wires as well to add a little bit more grip there. I'm doing it to my leaves, mostly just to show you how to do it. You do not have to. I'm pretty sure in the PDF I did not add the floral tape to the leaf stems, but it does also help to smooth out your stem wire as well because it covers over all these little ridges. It can make your stem look a little bit more smooth. So this is optional. All right. Now to add in the leaves, I'm just going to be using floral tape. You can use full width floral tape for this. I just have these little pieces of half width left over, so I'm just going to use that so I don't, waste it. All right, now we're going to put these leaves right below where that last little layer of floss ends. And it doesn't really matter whether you put the front or the back in of the leaves inward, or you can face them outward. It's not a big deal with this flower. You can do either. Because I think either way, those lacing wires are going to show just a little bit on the back of those leaves. So if you're worried about it at all, you can face it backwards. So those lacing wires are toward the inside of the flower. They might show a little bit less that way. But either way, I think they're going to be exposed a little bit. So I'm not too worried about which direction I'm putting my leaves. Again, I'm going to stretch the end of my floral tape. And I'm going to add my little leaf in. You might be able to add these all in at the same time. If not, then you can just add them in a couple at a time, one or two at a time. So you can add in one, wrap a couple times. I'm keeping the floral tape level so that I don't move down the stem. So I want all my leaves to be at the same height. Okay, so now I'm going to add in the last two here. And I want my leaves to kind of surround the stem. I don't want them all on the exact same side of my stem. So make sure that I'm encircling with those leaves. All right, and we're going to use this floral tape to continue around. If you're having a hard time getting it to attach with just floral tape, you can cut a couple feet of 30 gauge wire or 32 gauge wire and use that to kind of bind the leaves to the stem first and then cover with floral tape. That's another tool that you can use there to help you assemble your flowers. All right, I'm going to wrap down to the bottom of the little individual leaf stem wires there, and then just break the tape off. Now right below the leaves, I'm going to wrap with this beige ivory colored floss, just about an inch down there below the leaves. I'm just going to cut a little bit off of my little skein. Well, it's not a skein anymore, it's a mess now. So I'm going to put, just like before we did with the flower, I'm going to put the tail of my floss downward toward the bottom of the stem and kind of pinch that right below where the leaves are. Now I'm going to wrap just to make sure that I get a nice clean right below the leaves. I'm going to wrap once with this beige floss right there, right above the leaves. That's also going to help make sure that my beige floss doesn't slip off on me while I'm assembling, so it kind of helps hold it in place. Alright, and then I'm going to wrap right below the leaves. Sometimes you get, like my floss there is kind of separating around, that's a little stem wire that's exposed there. Sometimes if you push on that or even get some pliers and squeeze it, it kind of flattens out the lump so that it doesn't separate as much. I'm just going to go with it. I might just wrap over that spot twice with my, oh, I've got a little wonky wrap there with my embroidery floss, so I'm going to undo it. Didn't quite get low enough with that embroidery floss wrap right there. Okay. Now I'm going to restart again. And so anytime I have any separated floss, sometimes I'll just wrap over that spot again. I don't want it to get too bulky with my floss because then it's going to look a little unnatural and lumpy. But if you just have a little bit of a division there, then you can just wrap over that spot twice. I'll untwist my floss, spin my stem, untwist the floss, and spin. And we're just going to go down maybe an inch here below the leaves with this lighter color. On my original crocuses, I actually mixed a few different browns together just by separating out individual pieces of the floss. I had like a darker brown, a lighter brown, and then a very pale one like this. So I mixed a few colors together for my original ones. Alright, then again, I'm just going to tie off the end of my floss to secure it just by looping it around the stem, up through the loop, tie a knot. And then I'm going to cover over, because this is the bottom of our stem, I'm going to cover over this little tail of floss with some floral tape, just so it doesn't get in the way while I'm trying to pot my flowers. Let's use some of this floral tape that I cut off earlier. So again, stretch the stem, wrap it around the stem, stick it to itself on the other side, and then go down the stem. And there I have a finished crocus flower.